It was December 24th, 1958, a night that cut through the skin like a rusted razor, the kind of cold that didn't just sit on the surface of Harlem but seeped into the marrow of its bones. The wind howled down 125th Street, rattling the neon signs of the jazz clubs and whistling through the cracked brickwork of the tenements, carrying with it the scent of coal dust and impending snow. They say it was the coldest Christmas Eve on record, the mercury dipping so low that the Hudson River looked like a sheet of jagged iron under the moonlight. But for the residents of the towering tenement block at the corner of 142nd and Lenox, the cold wasn't just weather. It was a weapon. Inside apartment 4B, a woman named Martha Gable was wrapped in every scrap of fabric she owned, holding her 4-year-old son Timmy against her chest as if her own heartbeat could force warmth into his fragile, shivering frame. The boy's breathing was ragged, a wet, rattling sound that terrified Martha more than the dark, because the radiators in the building were stone cold, silent monuments to a landlord's greed. That landlord was Reginald Higgins, a man who lived miles away in a sprawling Tudor estate in Scarsdale, where the fireplaces roared with oak logs and the air smelled of roasted goose and expensive brandy. Higgins was a man who viewed his tenants not as people, but as cattle, to be milked for rent and then ignored when the winter set in. He had cut the heating oil delivery to the Lenox building 3 days prior to squeeze a few extra percentages of profit for the quarter, ignoring the frantic calls, the pleas of mothers, and the threats of city inspectors who were too slow to act. To Higgins, the complaints of Harlem were distant noise, easily drowned out by the clinking of crystal glasses at his holiday party. He believed himself untouchable, protected by distance, money, and the color of his skin, completely unaware that in the intricate, dangerous chessboard of Harlem, he had just moved his pawn into the path of the queen. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in the back booth of the Blue Morocco, a singular figure of stillness amidst the chaotic joy of holiday revelry. He was dressed in a suit of midnight blue Italian wool, cut so sharp it could draw blood, his tie a silk whisper of silver, and a glass of scotch resting untouched near his hand. Bumpy was not a man who needed to shout to be heard. His presence alone was a gravitational force that bent the room around him. While others laughed and danced to the rhythm of the jukebox, Bumpy's eyes, dark and unreadable as a deep well, were fixed on a game of chess he was playing against himself. He picked up a knight, turned it slowly in his manicured fingers, and set it down with a soft click, just as one of his lieutenants, a massive man named Big Tiny, leaned down to whisper in his ear. The music didn't stop, the laughter didn't fade, but the temperature at Bumpy's table seemed to drop 10 degrees as he listened to the news about Mrs. Gable's boy and the icebox that Higgins called an apartment building. Bumpy didn't slam the table. He didn't curse. He simply picked up his glass, took a slow, measured sip, and looked at Tiny with an expression that was terrifyingly devoid of anger, replaced instead by a clinical, lethal disappointment. He stood up, buttoned his cashmere overcoat, and adjusted his fedora, transforming in that instant from a patron of the arts into the grim reaper of Harlem, silently signaling that court was now in session, and the verdict had already been reached. 2 hours later, the festive warmth of Scarsdale was shattered not by a scream, but by the quiet, efficient click of a lock being picked. Reginald Higgins was dozing in his leather armchair, a snifter of cognac balancing on his chest, when the draft hit him, a sudden gust of wind from the French doors that shouldn't have been open. He stirred, blinking his eyes open, expecting to see a servant, but instead found himself staring into the barrels of 2 silencers held by men who looked like shadows cut from the night itself. Before Higgins could draw a breath to scream, a gloved hand clamped over his mouth, and he was hoisted from his chair with the ease of a rag doll. There were no rough words, no beatings, just a terrifying professional silence as he was marched out of his mansion, stripped of his heavy velvet smoking jacket, and shoved into the back of a black Cadillac that idled like a hearse in the driveway. The drive back to the city was long and silent, the heater in the car turned off, giving Higgins his first taste of the chill that was to come, a prelude to a lesson that would rewrite the architecture of his soul. They brought him to the very building he had neglected, dragging him up 4 flights of stairs that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. They didn't take him to a basement or a torture chamber. They took him to apartment 4C, the empty unit directly across from Mrs. Gable's, a mirror image of the freezing hell he had created for his tenants. The apartment was a hollow shell, stripped of furniture, the wallpaper peeling like dead skin, and the air inside was so cold that their breath bloomed in great gray clouds. Bumpy Johnson was already there, sitting on a singular wooden chair he had brought for himself, positioned in the center of the room like a throne. He was wrapped in his thick coat, wearing leather gloves and a scarf of fine wool, looking warm, comfortable, and utterly imperious. Across from him, a second chair waited, a rickety wooden stool. The windows were not just cracked, they were thrown wide open, inviting the blizzard that was beginning to swirl outside to come in and make itself at home. Higgins was shoved onto the stool. He was wearing only his soaked pajamas and thin slippers. The shock of the cold was immediate and violent, a physical assault that made his teeth chatter within seconds. He looked at Bumpy, his eyes wide with the confusion of a man who has never faced consequences. "Do you know who I am?" Higgins stammered, his voice trembling as the wind whipped around his ankles. "I'll have the police. I'll have you all." Bumpy raised a single finger, and the silence that followed was heavier than the lead in a bullet. He looked at Higgins with the curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Higgins," Bumpy said, his voice smooth, cultured, and echoing slightly in the empty room. "You are a businessman, a man of contracts, a man of transactions. And tonight, we are here to audit your books." Bumpy stood up slowly and walked to the open window, looking out at the snow-covered street below. "You see, Mr. Higgins, in Harlem, we have a different understanding of value. You believe value comes from the rent check you cash. I believe value comes from the promise you make when you cash it. You promised heat. You promised shelter." Bumpy turned back, his face hard as granite. "You took the money, but you didn't deliver the goods. That's bad business. And I hate bad business." Higgins hugged himself, his skin turning a mottled shade of pale blue and pink. "I'll turn it on," he chattered, desperation leaking into his tone. "I'll call the super right now. Just let me go to a phone. I'll turn it on." Bumpy shook his head slowly, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's too late for phone calls, Reginald. The oil trucks are sleeping. The superintendent is drunk. And little Timmy across the hall is still coughing. Logic dictates that until the heat returns for them, it cannot return for you. We must maintain equilibrium." The hours began to stretch, marked only by the chime of a distant clock tower and the intensifying howl of the wind. Bumpy didn't touch him. He didn't raise a fist. He simply sat there, pouring himself a cup of hot tea from a thermos, the steam rising in taunting ribbons that danced in front of Higgins' freezing face. Bumpy began to tell stories, his voice hypnotic and low. He spoke of the history of Harlem, of the men who built the buildings, of the mothers who scrubbed floors on their knees to pay rent to men like Higgins. He spoke of the physiology of hypothermia, how the body shunts blood from the extremities to the core, how the mind begins to hallucinate warmth right before the end, how the heart slows down until it simply forgets to beat. "It's a peaceful way to go, they say," Bumpy mused, taking a sip of tea. like falling asleep in a snowdrift. Is that how you feel, Reginald? Are you sleepy? By 3 a.m., Higgins was no longer demanding his release. He was weeping. The snot froze on his upper lip. His hands were numb claws, useless and white. He curled into a ball on the stool, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. The arrogance of the landlord was stripped away, layer by layer, until all that was left was a frightened, naked animal. Bumpy watched this deconstruction with the patience of a grandmaster waiting for the inevitable checkmate. He stood up and walked over to the shivering man, looming over him like a monolith. "Mrs. Gable's son has pneumonia," Bumpy said softly. "The doctor says his fever is spiking because his body is fighting the cold. He feels exactly what you feel now. Fear, pain, abandonment. Do you understand that connection now, Reginald? Do you feel it in your toes, in your lungs?" Higgins couldn't speak. He could only nod violently, his jaw locked in a spasm of shivering. He looked up at Bumpy with eyes that begged for mercy, for a crumb of humanity. Bumpy stared down at him for a long, agonizing minute, letting the man weigh the cost of his greed against the value of his life. Then, with a sigh of disdain, Bumpy reached behind him and picked up a bundle. It wasn't a fur coat. It wasn't a heater. It was a thin, gray, moth-eaten wool blanket, the same kind Mrs. Gable had draped over her son. It smelled of old soup and dust. Bumpy tossed it onto Higgins' lap. "Compliments of the house," Bumpy said. "It's not much, but it's all you tenants have. See if it's enough to keep the soul inside the body." Higgins clutched the dirty blanket as if it were the golden fleece, wrapping it around his trembling shoulders, sobbing into the coarse fabric. It offered barely any warmth against the sub-zero draft, but it was a lifeline. Bumpy buttoned his coat, checked his watch, and signaled to his men. "The sun rises in 3 hours, Mr. Higgins. If you survive until then, you can leave. If you don't, well, we'll just say the heating system failed you, just like it failed everyone else." Bumpy walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. He didn't look back as he delivered the final strike. "And Reginald, if that boiler isn't roaring by noon, I won't come back with a blanket next time. I'll come back with a shovel." The door clicked shut, leaving Higgins alone in the dark, in the cold, huddled under a rag of a blanket, listening to the wind scream his name. When the sun finally broke over the Harlem skyline, pale and weak, Higgins stumbled out of the building, half-frozen, blue-lipped, and broken. He didn't go to the police. He didn't go to the press. He went straight to the hospital to treat his frost-bitten toes, and then he went to the bank. By noon that Christmas day, the boiler in the basement of the Lenox tenement was roaring so hard the pipes banged with the glorious sound of steam. The heat that flooded into Mrs. Gable's apartment was tropical. But Higgins went further. Driven by a fear that had been frozen permanently into his psyche, he anonymously paid the hospital bills for Timmy Gable. He replaced the windows in the building the following spring. He never raised the rent again, as long as he owned the deed. Years later, people would whisper about why the Higgins building always had the best heat in Harlem, even when fuel was scarce. They said the landlord had gone mad or found Jesus. But the old-timers, the ones sitting on the stoops watching the world go by, they knew better. They knew it wasn't Jesus who visited Reginald Higgins that cold Christmas Eve. It was Bumpy Johnson. It was a lesson taught not with fire, but with ice, a move on the chessboard that secured the safety of the pawns by sacrificing the comfort of the king. Bumpy never bragged about it. He never claimed credit. He just sat in the blue Morocco, playing his chess, watching over his city with that cold, calculating, and strangely loving gaze. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? In a world full of laws written on paper that no one follows, maybe what we really need is a man who writes his laws on the hearts of the wicked with the ink of fear. Bumpy Johnson didn't wear a badge, and he didn't hold office, but on that freezing night in 1958, he was the only government Harlem had. So I ask you, if you were freezing in the dark, waiting for a savior who never comes, would you pray for a saint, or would you pray for a sinner like Bumpy? Tell me, who is the real hero in a story like this? The law that turned a blind eye, or the gangster who forced the devil to feel the cold?